Hello, and welcome to A Sunny Book Nook. Today I'm here with my part 2 of nonfiction book recommendations. I created the first video in this series, I suppose, sometime last summer, and that'll be in the cards, obviously. So I've been looking forward to following up with more recommendations. These can also count as my favorite nonfiction books of 2020 video, which I never made, so this can be it. This is going to be a pretty long video. I have 15 books on this list to discuss, and they're all pretty important, I think. Basically, all of this nonfiction ties together themes of a lot of societal issues regarding racism and capitalism and gender oppression, etc., are ultimately addressed within these books in a really compelling way that I think will allow you to critically think better and engage with the world in a better way. So I truly cannot recommend these books enough. I think I'm going to list these books out from most commercial to most academic or theoretical. I mean, they're all important, and I think they're all written in simple enough language for any person to pick up and get something from, but I'm just going to try to make it into this vague order for organizational purposes, I suppose. So the first book I have here is Hood Feminism by Mikki Kendall. So many people have talked about this book, so I'm sure you know that this is a anti-racist, anti-sexist sort of like analysis and breakdown that counters white feminism and really centers intersectional feminism in a modern lens. This was written, this was released like in the late 2010s, so it is pretty contemporary, and it's written very simply with elements of narrative from the author's life, and I think that the observations she makes as a Black woman and from her own experiences, as well as the statistical observations of the world, are really on point and definitely extrapolate from a lot of Black feminist theory and scholarship. The next book on this list is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. This book is just so beautiful and incredible and amazing. It ties the ideas of Indigenous ways of being and biology and science and the earth. This is kind of a memoir, kind of just nonfiction about environment, because our author is a Native woman who is a biologist, I believe. She talks about both her experiences becoming a biologist and also her understanding of how her Indigenous heritage and cultures and practices are deeply connected with her scientific study of the earth and natural life. So many elements of this book, from descriptions of her teaching classes and trying to engage students, to her experiences as a mother, to her experiences in academia and how racist it can be, were fascinating. And that, combined with the knowledge of plants was so good. The book talks about settler colonialism and the earth and how these things are deeply interconnected. Indigenous ways of life and making yourself indigenous to the land is really like integral to being able to maintain a long-term relationship between nature and humanity. Robin Wall Kimmerer also talks a lot about the framework of man versus nature and the idea that people should claim land as their own and basically, colonize it and extrapolate it for its resources. The author talks about reciprocation really looks like, and how we must give back to the earth the way that the earth gives to us, and how that is really a key epistemology within being Native. This book was just so incredible, and I urge you to pick it up. The audiobook is narrated by the author, and she has a very soothing and calm voice. I highly recommend. The next book on this list is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. Even though this came out in, I think, the 80s or something, and it's written a little bit more academically, I think, but very simply still. It's kind of weird for me to put it this early on the list, but the thing is that I think this book is so important and I need more people to read it, so I really wanted to prioritize its presence in this video. This book basically explains how colonialism, capitalism, anti-blackness, and the destabilization of the African continent, as well as the pillaging of resources and people from Africa, is really deeply integral to the global economy, and how these things are really tied together, and ultimately they benefit each other, and they operate on a mutual scale of capitalism and exploitation and anti-blackness and racism, as well as how Europe is ultimately the cause behind the intentional underdevelopment of countries because of how extractive and colonial relationship his historical and scientific observations of this underdevelopment was mind-blowing, and it truly will change your perception of the world. Even if you already think you know how the world operates in a way that exploits and extracts from Africa, the details that this book goes into and just the kind of statistical analyses going on here, it kind of combats a lot of these misunderstandings of the causes of poverty and the causes of political corruption and stuff that people regularly associate with the continent of Africa. So this book is just brilliant. Walter Rodney was a militant socialist, and his words are just genius. The next book on this list is They Were Her Property by Stephanie Jones Rogers. This book talks about white women in the antebellum South and slavery. It debunks the historical myth that white women were these delicate flower babies who had nothing to do with the impurity of slavery, when in reality they themselves were slaveholders and acted as such. So this book was really gruesome, but it really brought to life and brought to horrible, revolting reality of the nature of white womanhood and the violence inherent to that, especially in America, from historical context as well as just the stories from primary sources of how women treated enslaved people and how enslaved people remember their lives. I feel like this is a book that kind of gives you a step in the direction of what your American history class never taught you about slavery and its brutality. Another book that is a reintroduction and reframing of America from the perspective of how it's foundationally racist, you should definitely check out Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. This is a fat book. This is basically a textbook in and of itself, but honestly, it's definitely worth a read, because the way that this book traces back all racist institutions, ideas, myths back to these historical events and how they would feed and bolster people in power, and how these racist ideas and systems and structures were intentionally constructed to benefit a specific group of people for specific reasons, even when a lot of the ideas were fundamentally really illogical or not scientifically based or whatever. And he basically goes about explaining how racism and specifically anti-blackness functions in America. And I think that this is a pretty good comprehensive history, but it by no means should be the only thing someone reads. I think you definitely need to supplement your reading of this with something else. It's still really good and incredibly informative. The next book on this list is Disability Visibility by Alice Wong. Well, edited by Alice Wong. Alice Wong is the creator of a podcast and website called Disability Visibility, where she interviews various disabled people and just asks them about their lives and their experiences. And this book is a collection of essays from various disability advocates, writers, and disabled people who wrote about their experiences as well as their analyses of the world. And I think that this book is so fundamental to an understanding of how the world is set up against disabled people, and seeing the perspectives of so many different kinds of people was really fascinating, as well as just so necessary, because I think that like the minimization, erasure, and just constant sort of dismissal of disability in like leftist spaces or in social justice work or whatever is really not good and really bad, because obviously like disability impacts and interacts with all other identities in a really fundamental way, and I think this book does a really good job of unpacking that. And there are some essays in here that do such a good job of talking about how ableism and anti-blackness work together to make the police state even more of a violent threat towards people, as well as how misogyny and the idea that women are fundamentally only useful for their looks or their ability to reproduce are kind of countered by the experiences of people who like can't reproduce, and also how capitalism and the understanding of what is ability and what does being disabled mean and look like interact together in a really important way. Like they shape each other. This book is just really phenomenal, and I can't recommend it enough. The next book on this list is the Gender Accelerationist Manifesto. I link this in the description box of a previous video, and I'll link it for this one as well. This book is so good. It's not even a book, it's literally a manifesto, and it's really short. My PDF download of it is like 15 pages long, and it is phenomenal. It talks about how gender interacts with capitalism and colonialism in a really integral way, and how even though gender precedes capitalism and precedes colonialism, they interact in the present in a really important way. I talked about this book more in my wrap-up for my January reads, so check that out if you haven't already, if you want to know more of my initial thoughts and reaction to this book, because I filmed that the day after I had read that book. And this manifesto just, it does such a good job at describing how queerness and transness and any sort of diversion from the heterosexual cisnormative kind of standards of a patriarchal capitalist colonial society, deviation from that creates a class of people that are the oppressed group within this dynamic, and that defines like queerness, and also how the state in like a Marxist sense, meaning corporations and the government and capitalist, and also like science and bioessentialism, all these things like work together to make gender and sexuality this like really awful thing, very oppressive in various ways. This manifesto is just so good. I cannot recommend this enough, but I think that this one has a little bit more jargon. So if you do check this out, I think it's also important to read not just books, but like shorter pieces of theory and stuff. So I'll link some other readings down below that maybe describe like what the state is in like a Marxist Leninist sense, or what like dialectical materialism is, or what the superstructure and the base is, like stuff like that. Like if you don't quite understand what the manifesto is talking about, like do a little Google search or like message me, and I will try to explain it the best I can to you. But this book is so short. I mean, it's a manifesto, so like you have to check it out, and it just, wow. It also talks about the difference between sex and gender in a way that goes beyond bioessentialist cis het norms, and also the understanding of like how culture and the state, the means of production and family and all these things all inform each other to create gender. It's incredible, it's amazing, and you have to check it out. The next book on this list is Women, Culture, and Politics by Angela Davis. This book is a collection of Angela Davis's essays, and I have annotated the hell out of it. It talks a lot about a lot of different feminist issues, from combating white feminism to like revolution to racism and criticizing like Reagan era policies, as well as the perception of Muslim women in the Middle East, that's like a fake term, but anyways, or like just women in the global south who are Muslim, and the patronizing nature of white feminists towards these women. It talks about so many different things. It also comments on other people's writings and other feminist sort of theory. It's so intelligent and so well written, to the point, decisive, coherent, beautiful. You must check this out, and I'm sure you can find a free PDF of this somewhere or a free audiobook on YouTube, because a lot of Angela Davis's work you can find for free. The next book I have on this list is Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. Oh man, this book is another one I have annotated the hell out of. Every time I annotate a book, I feel the need to show it off, because so rarely do I have the motivation to do so, but this book got me motivated for it. This book had me pen in hand, marking it up, skimming it again. Oh my gosh, so good. Everything from sexism to racism in academia and feminist scholarship, motherhood, lesbianism, and practicing care and love on a community and like self level as a way to combat capitalism and also like colonialism in a current political sense. I think the last essay in this book is so powerful because its breakdown of Grenada and what happened with US intervention there is so parallel to so many different US imperialist projects throughout history and the present day. And wow, it's incredible. This book also includes the seminal pieces, uses of the erotic, and the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. It's just so good. So good. It's a life-changing book. If you haven't picked it up already, you most definitely should. The next book on this list is one that is quite commercial, so I guess I should have put it earlier on this list, but it's pretty niche as well, I think, and that is White Too Long by Robert P. Jones. This book is about white supremacy and white Christianity in America. It traces it back from the founding of America as well as the ways that Christianity and churches across the US enabled racist policies and enforced them, as well as created them and furthered them. It's very good. However, be aware of the liberalization, I guess, of a lot of how this book talks about. It gives off a little bit white liberal vibes because what it considers to be rehabilitation or reconciliation is oftentimes not even the bare minimum. And also the person writing this book is a white man who grew up in the South in a Baptist church, and he's kind of writing from his research explanations of how many like white Christians don't think they're racist. They think they are accepting of everyone and pure and godly and whatever the hell. However, they fundamentally believe racist things and are entrenched in racist institutions, and it's really interesting. However, I would have to say that this book focuses more on Protestant churches because they tend to be more predominant within the US than Catholic churches, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't apply to like the Catholic Church or observations of the Catholic Church operating in America either. I sent my friend who is training to be a priest to read, and he read this book and he really enjoyed it and he got a lot out of it. So I think that if you're really religious, or if you're not religious at all, or if you're not Christian, Nonfiction, this is still a really interesting book to pick up because it connects a lot of these cultural and religious themes into a history of America that we understand to be racist. I also think it's just a really sharp slap in the face to a lot of people that many people need, because the willful ignorance and the violent rejection of any idea that white churches are anything less than magnanimous and wonderful can oftentimes be very, very controversial. I mentioned this in previous videos, but it's like the means of production and how things are produced, and like commerce and capitalists and workers and all that, like meaning the base of society, the things that enforce this versus the things that like are a result of it / feed into it, which part of that is like religion. Part of that is religion, family, and culture, which, you know, like Christianity fundamentally has such a grip on in the US. And if Christianity, as a part of the religious and cultural elements of this country, has really racist roots and past within America and globally, then how do you even begin to tackle like racism? A lot of people don't even want to. So, you know, I think this book is really thought-provoking, and definitely pick it up, especially if you're Christian. The next book I have on this list, I gave to my friend to borrow like a while back, and that is How We Get Free, the Combahee River Collective by Keonga Taylor. This book is a collection of various essays between people who were in the Combahee River Collection, which was a Black feminist socialist group of women who are activists and writers and people who are on the forefront of Black feminist struggle. And I think that this book was so interesting. At the very beginning of the book, there is the Combahee River Collective statement, which is a really seminal piece of what we now understand to be like intersectional. For some reason, my camera stopped recording right when I said intersectional feminism. Boo, camera. So if I'm in a bit of a different angle or, you know, something's different, I'm sorry. Anyways, this book is very important, and it's really, really short. It's really easy to get through because obviously it's just like the first chapter is the statement, and then each other chapter is just interviews with previous members of the collective, and it's really enlightening because you get to see these people who were a part of a movement and who still are a part of a movement looking back on their lives and how they joined, as well as like seeing where they are now and what they're doing now and what they think of the world now. But it's definitely a little bit dated because I think it came out in like 2017, so it's talking a little bit about like Trump's election and stuff like that is like not as pertinent necessarily like right now, but I think a lot of the political and socio-cultural outtakes and statements through this book are so important and wonderful and amazing. The next book on this list is The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. This is another piece of classic American work, I guess. And this book talks about James Baldwin's experiences growing up with a pastor as a father and his really tough relationship with him, as well as his struggles with like masculinity and religion and sexuality, and his observations about race in America and racism and anti-Blackness, and his experience meeting Malcolm X and going to dinner with the Nation of Islam. And this book is just very heartbreaking and thought-provoking, and will always be timely, will always be important and necessary, and it's a really beautifully written book as well, and it's pretty short, so definitely read this book. The next book on this list is Fearing the Black Body by Sabrina Strings. This book is a bit of a more academic and heavier text, I believe, but it talks about and details the history of repulsion towards fat bodies and bigger bodies and black bodies, how these things are connected, how colonialism has impacted people's understanding of what is aesthetically pleasing in women's bodies, how women's bodies are commodified, and how under capitalism, anti-black imagery of like black women is circulated as well as like criticized in a cultural way. And I think that this book goes into the history of perceived aesthetics, cultural aesthetics, as well as the history of some of the science behind what is considered unhealthy or healthy about fatness and weight and your body size and what you look like, and how that changes throughout time within various cultures and through like the different like art phases of history, across history. This book is so important and fascinating and such an incredible work that kind of breaks down how all of these things are connected, from how we view fat bodies to colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. This book is very good, and I need to go back through it and mark it up and highlight it, because I listened to this on audiobook partially, and that was a really good audiobook as well. But it does read like a textbook, like a history textbook sometimes, so definitely be aware of that when you go in. It's like, it's not written necessarily very commercially, I suppose. Okay, and finally, the last book on this list, which is also super important, and oh, it's so good, but it is a little bit harder to read, I think, and that is Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. This book talks about colonization, decolonization, the colonized mind and psyche, how capitalism operates in the first world versus the exploited world, how colonialism is a lasting thing, how colonial occupation and military occupation works and impacts societies and cultures, and violence, and how people relate to each other. This book is so good. I read this in a book club last summer, and I highly recommend you do this reading in sort of a book club setting almost, or a discussion setting, because I swear every chapter we discussed had hours worth of conversation and extrapolations to be made, because this work is just so genius. But it is pretty wordy, and I think it was originally written in French in like the 60s or the 80s or something. Oh my gosh, I'm so bad about like the dates or the eras that books are published, but this book is definitely more wordy and academic, but it's very good, and I think super important if you ever want to even understand what like decolonization looks like. And also, it is very critical of the colonized bourgeoisie, and defines them and describes them and figures out like how they are also exploitative and taking advantage of countries or a group of people's unstable and perilous sort of position. Those are all the books I have on this list today. I haven't recommended any like heavier theory, I guess, because if you want to read like economic theory, like if you want to read like Marx's Capital or whatever, like you do that, more power to you. But I think these are pretty engaging and interesting in their connections of the economic Marxist analysis that has been made, while applying it to things that precede Marx, things like slavery and settler colonialism and sexism. These books connect these things in, I think, a pretty readable way. Almost all of these books are pretty readable, I think, even the ones that lean more towards textbookish. They're still like really compelling. I really hope that this was helpful for you. I tried to include like some queer theory, lots of Black feminist theory, of course, a lot of sort of history, because I think that knowing like theory and having like read Engels and Hegel and whatever, that is different from reading like history and understanding history, which is very important as well. You can't like have one without the other. Also, the last book that I also talked about in my first video that I need to reiterate again, like before any of these books, I think you should definitely check out State and Revolution by Lenin, because in Lenin's work, State and Revolution, excerpts of a lot of seminal Marxist and Hegelian and like Engels texts are in there, so like you can get some of the philosophical backings of some of the terminology and stuff that is used and reappropriated, you know, like throughout time and throughout these different books. And it gives these definitions, and it also presents a lot of very good points in its observations about capitalism and the bourgeois democratic state, as well as accounting for police and prisons as an arm of and enforcing the state, and also the transition of power between capitalism and communism and what that looks like, as well as just like so many definitions that I think will be really helpful for you as a framework going into the rest of these books, because these are all books that I pretty much read after I read State and Revolution by Lenin, and I think the framework of State and Revolution gives a lot of preface to the rest of these books, because in State and Revolution we are told like how revolution works, and also the impact of like imperialism and how imperialism and capitalism are siblings, like how they work together. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what these book recommendations are ultimately about is how like everything is connected and all systems of oppression operate as this oppressive totality, as the Gender Accelerationist Manifesto talks about as well. So please let me know if you've read any of these books and what you think of them, and if you have any other books you would like to add to this list. I'm always trying to read more, and once I read more nonfiction, I don't think I've read any nonfiction this year yet. That's on me, I'm sorry. But once I get to more like theory and nonfiction and stuff, I will definitely make a part 3 to this video. I mean, I think it's important for people to read and to learn about the world and how it operates and works on an oppressive and systemic level, so that you can understand what we can do as a collective to work against that. And that is the end of this video. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that stupid bullshit. Please subscribe, please do, because not only do I read really cool and good nonfiction books that you should read too, I also read fiction books that are really cool and good and you should read too. And I also really enjoy applying like Marxist and feminist analysis to fiction books I'm reading, and I really can't help it. Like, it just happens at this point. Moving forward, I'm definitely gonna have more like reviews and stuff up that connect these things together, because I find that fascinating. I love media analysis that does that. So let me know if that sounds interesting to you as well. Anyways, finally, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!